Hello. Okay. The subject of tonight's broadcast, which is actually kind of duplicated over on the on my Facebook channel. It's the recent Netflix adaptation of Cowboy Bebop. I just wanted to get my views out on another channel. Let me start by saying, what I don't find objectionable. I think John Cho and Mustafa Shakir um, both play Spike and Jet Black perfectly. I have no problem. Um, I think they played Faye Valentine. She does well in quieter moments, but the effects are good. Um, some of the action is pretty nifty, but all that said, all that said, I'm disappointed, very disappointed in it. Let me tell you the reasons what that I'm not disappointed about it. I'm not disappointed because they cast it in a woke manner. Please don't give me that crap. I don't care about your need to have everything be cast like it was in the 80s and 90s. The demographics are changing and so will the casting, because the for one thing, this is an international business now, with and they make their money all over the world. So just having white people in the cast, no. And our country is changing. Demographics are more, you know, white people are less of a majority than they once were, and that's just the plain fact. So I don't particularly care for all this. Oh, it's too woke. And I don't particularly. I mean, Gren. mm, I don't mind the Grin character. I don't mind him. I'm wondering how they'll do the space line, uh, the space line style episode if they ever do it. I don't know. But that's not really where I think the adaptation fails. And I don't want to be. I don't like to be the person who says a thing fails. I don't like to be that person. I like to be the person who enjoys things, who gives everything he watches a fair chance. I like to be like that. I don't really see the point of going out of your way to hate something that you're watching for entertainment. Entertainment is casual. It's you, you, you're not watching to be a professional critic. Let the professional critics be the people who nitpick things to death. I'm not a professional critic. I don't want to be a professional critic. But I'd say it's useful. I mean, there is a point at which you have to admit that something just didn't work quite like it ought to have worked. And if I were to identify the major problems, um, let's start with I think they tried to be. I think the writers confused being adult in terms of content with being adult in terms of tone. Um, I think that the writers also failed to really appreciate um, the sophistication of Cowboy Bebop's characterization, the sophistication of its episodes. You know, relatively simple plot, but you had Spike Spiegel and the rest. You had them doing a great deal of um, you had them doing a great deal of going to different places, and there was a lot of world building to that. Both in the action set pieces and in the sort of slice of life approach that they took. Um, I can understand some of the shortcuts if this was a book adaptation, but the problem is, and you have the you have the original out on Netflix right there for people to compare. The problem comes when you do a live action adaptation that manages to reduce the scope, reduce the world building, reduce the qualities of the storytelling that made the anime so profound of a hit with people. People loved Cowboy Bebop because, for one thing, it's got very good emotionally mature storytelling. It's got fairly well-rounded characters. It You get a sense of humanity in the future. I mean, I said deep spoilers for the anime series, as well as the Netflix series. It takes place in a time where Earth has essentially been the moon has been you know cracked into pieces by a hyperspace gateway accident, and the net result of that is that the um, people have had to basically flee Earth for the outer and inner parts of the solar system, um, which is why so many of the parts of the story are set on the moons of Jupiter and the outer planets, the other outer planets. Um, and what what that what that gives to it, you have all these different situations, all these different unique, colorful stories. And what does the Netflix series do with the added time per episode? What does the Netflix series do? It takes the mystery out of two of the more enigmatic characters, for one thing, filling in a lot of the episodes with you know, a sort of a soap opera-esque situation with Vicious and Julia, characters who only appear in a few key episodes in the original. Um, and it does they do injustice to those two characters um, in a couple ways. One by making Julia far too you know far too well known. She's a lost Lenore. She is Spike speak with a person whose absence haunts Spike Spiegel. But part of that absence, we need sort of that absence for ourselves. So the character needs to we need to get just glimpses of that character over the over the course of the first parts of the story. I mean, it seemed like they were in a hurry to get through a lot of the meaty part of the storytelling that the original did. Um, and that haste that I mean it's such haste that they literally take what would be the revelation from a full they did a full episode to flesh out why Faye Valentine is the way she is. They did a whole full episode of it later on in I think the second half of the series, and it adds a lot of depth to that character. Pardon me. the The issue I think is that they have her just info dump. One of the clumsiest info dumps I've watched in recent time. She have her just info dump all the information that she that you would get if you had watched that episode. They take away a that magnificent sort of you know problematic, the magnificent sort of romantic, her getting swept off her feet storyline, and they turn it into a rather. And they've done this with multiple episodes where they just go for quirky endings and you know threats deflated instead of characters that had deep that strong sort of or strong sort of challenges. A lot of these very challenging characters just get deflated by the way the writers approached them. And part of the deflation is that a lot of the key big set pieces for these episodes that are fleshed out in intricate detail in the original anime that are just given this enormous they're given these large scale sort of chases and you know action set pieces are you would think that if you were doing an adaptation of a anime series to live action that you would want to expand on the expand visually, expand action wise on the original action sequences, but instead almost universally they compress, crush these action set pieces to where that you're just left you're just left with it's not even a parody of those old sequences. It's just a whimpering sort of ghost of those sequences. And I think that's one of the things that I think disappointed people time and time again is that you had a whole bunch of they were trying to be quirky, like space Tarantino, complete with the language, complete with the nudity, complete with the you know complete. I guess with some. I mean, it's not necessarily too much more grotesquely violent than the anime, which had its share of blood spilled. Uh, but you get this sort of they make it all just you don't want with something like this for eh, the original Cowboy Bebop was very cinematic in its style. That's one thing people need to keep in mind about this is that it's very cinematic. It draws on a whole bunch of you know it kind of fleshed things out to a much greater degree in that sort of sense in terms of composition, in terms of just getting this sort of feel of it just felt more like a movie. And Netflix unfortunately goes out of its way to turn Cowboy Bebop into something more like a generic sort of quirky crime related TV show, and sort of tries to do space Tarantino, like I said before. Um, and that's real unfortunate because I mean, part of what made we when you had the Yoko Kono song, you know, the you have these set pieces that were just you know intricately choreographed with that Yoko Kanno music, to where you could get that sort of you know this is they made it less. They kind of squeezed a lot of the fun out of it. They squeezed a lot of the you know character work and a lot of the other things so they could just substitute in something more conventional, something more like this other stuff that you see on TV these days. And I'm sure they thought they were doing us a favor by doing things that way, or that oh, the budget is just forcing us to do this. We can't do that on this budget. Well, if you can't do that on that budget, then let's be frank. Then don't do the series. You need to be committed to doing the you need to be committed to expanding, not contracting, expanding the size and scale of the world if you're doing a live action adaptation. Because quite frankly, what's the value if you don't do that? What's the value in making it smaller? In making it fit more into a conventional box? Another thing is, the way they dealt with Vicious, they've got a bad habit, and that is they are obsessed with explaining why people are the way they are. One of the things I loved about the Dark Knight were the way they dealt with the Joker, the multiple choice paths. You get that awful story about, oh my goodness, his father did it to him after he murdered his mother. Or no, he did it to himself so that he could sympathize, because his wife had gotten scarred in some way, and he did it to himself to, show solidarity with her. You know, and you had those those couldn't be true at the same time. So you knew that he was, whenever he said, "Do you want to know how I got these scars?" You know that he's really not going to give you a straight answer, and that really the answer doesn't matter. They should have played. They should have taken that lesson with Vicious. Vicious is never given any kind of real backstory in in the anime in terms of why he is the why he's the nasty customer he is. There's no monologue where he explains why how his father forced him to watch his mother commit suicide, and then there's no mention of his father. Nobody, it's not even brought up. But apparently, somebody thinks, oh, let's mention the father. Let's give him this backstory, and that'll explain, and that'll humanize him. And it's people going through the motions of doing character work without really gauging what exactly they're doing, and not looking at the source material to understand what made that character so iconic, what made that villain so intimidating. And really, you need that villain to be intimidating because that villain the is the opposite, the polar opposite, the antiparticle to Spike Spiegel. And I think that's one key thing right there that they just didn't understand that character that character wasn't a weasel. Like it turns out that Vicious is. That character isn't a weasel. Somebody who would need Spike Spiegel to clean up after him. You know, that's not the way Vicious is constructed in the anime. Vicious is much colder. He's the sort of guy who you might think he's your comrade, but he'll turn on you like a viper and bite. And in the original anime, when we see Grin, who's more like who's less of I don't mind the way they changed around Grin, made him sort of a I guess you could say non-binary sort of androgyne sort of character in that sense. I don't mind what they did with that. Um, where but when you had that in the anime, that character, the backstory of that character, which surprisingly they don't get into it since they're so eager to info dump all the backstory carrying episodes for they they seem to think that it's better to get all oh, here is the full portrait of the character. Now we start the story going forward. They got it backwards. You work towards that. The anime works towards that. Feeds you a controlled diet of details and facts and tendencies and habits and details about the character as they go on, not filling in everything and sort of satiating you at the beginning. It's sort of like giving people, a full bowl of vanilla ice cream and then expecting them to eat a full Thanksgiving dinner afterwards. You know, no. You kind of you give it, light appetizer, a little bit of info, and then you kind of build up. You have to have the patience to abstain in the beginning so that you can have your feast later, or so that you can have that more that uh, a richer sort of, because really the way people should get much of the details on what kind of character you've got there should be mostly what you see the character do, say. If it's a book, think and decide. You want to see, I mean, and the backstory is you add this in and then you go, oh, I see now. I see why he's like that. It's not, oh, we have to fill in that he's, a poor little daddy's boy who, no, no, that's not how you do it. That's not how you do it. You do not do you don't try for one thing with the vicious character. Vicious is not the kind of character who is explained. You don't explain that sort of character because he is more an insurmountable force than he's not meant to be. He is, as each character encounters him, he is this implacable, hostile, sort of, you know, demonically evil character. And you might get the sense that he's on your side, but then if you cross him, even without knowing it, if you fall in love with the wrong person, or if if they're trying to, run some gambit of some kind, and you become useless to, he's a he's a kind of sociopath who'll just stab you in the back without breaking a sweat, without getting all that flustered. But they instead with, I don't, the actor's giving his all, but the character is written as a weasel, as a bully, as a person with an uncontrollable temper, a brat. He, and by doing that to the villain, by doing that to the main villain, they basically kind of take the menace out of him. And if you take the menace out of a character like Vicious, you've kind of you've kind of you've made it to where it's, oh, of course, Spike's going to win because every time, he's superior in every way. Of course, Spike's going to win, and they're not thinking fourth dimensionally. They're not thinking. The audience needs to get the impression that those who cross this guy end up, and it's not this, sort of scene that where he out of nowhere figures out the double cross and then has this out of nowhere confrontation with his father, who isn't even featured in the anime. You know, they and instead of having her be a lost Lenora sort of love, they have her be a constant part of a melodrama going all the way through. I mean, I didn't mind what they did with her in the end, given all the things they changed. But if they wanted her to function as his sort of lost Lenore, they needed to realize that the show did the right thing in kind of making her a figure of memory, a figure of mystery, rather than this, you know, sort of, I don't know. Maybe they were trying to do something like Game of Thrones with, following her character along and kind of doing this sort of Start of Darkness thing. Um, but I they tossed it. I don't know how much, how many episodes had all this machination, and they just, it didn't add to the adaptation. It didn't. It just, who cares? Why are we so invested in this, in the stakes here? Why aren't we spending time with the main characters? Well, I'll tell you why. Because in many cases they were trying to kind of pad out. They were trying to pad out, make longer stories with the characters that were originally written for 20 to 30-minute long anime episodes. So they were taking, some of the backbone of the story and kind of, you know adding to it to, you know to bulk it up for the, for, closer to 1 hour installments like you would have on Netflix. They kind of stuffed, they took episodes that had very strong stories and padded them. They took care, they took action set pieces that had that were extraordinarily well choreographed, that took you on a tour of the geography of these different places, and they compressed them and, kind of locked them into smaller settings. They took something that should have expanded, that could have expanded the universe of the story a bit more, and instead took the opportunity to make it more conventional, to make it to kind of to add melodrama that people did not invest in as much as they hoped they would. Um, they took characters that had strength in their mystery, strength in how little but how significantly they showed up, and they kind of, by bloating their storyline, really, by adding a whole bunch of filler to it and kind of sucking all the mystery out of the characters and all the sort of equal and opposite power that Vicious had towards Spike. By doing that, they kind of took a lot of the life and the fun out of their adaptation. And what they tried to replace it with was, well, I mean, I don't, I did, I'm not a prude. I don't mind a little bit more nudity. I don't mind a bit more adult language. I don't mind a bit more violence. What I mind is if people think that that's, it's the old thing, it's adult content, but is it maturely handled material? And the original had maturely handled material. It had, you know, it had a sense of emotional weight to it. It's a child or a young actor, they'll go into doing a part, they'll go into doing a thing, thinking that it is the action that yields the power of the performance. That oh, if I do a death scenes are dramatic. Uh, you know, and I pointed out in my other video about like the distinction between how Bryan Singer handled a death scene, a scene of sacrifice in X2 versus how Brett Ratner does in X3. And the way that Bryan Singer deconstructed what it was that made um, what it was that made the X-Men tick for people. I mean, even as a Saturday morning cartoon, which I grew up watching, the X-Men series had these very strong storylines. They were children content, child age content, but they were very mature. They handled mature themes. In fact, they handled character death in the first episode. They they had dramatic storylines. They had characters making choices. They had they brought to fore the sort of the dramatic um, qualities of the characters. They took it seriously. I mean, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any sort of humor. There's plenty, but what both the X Men cartoon and the X Men live action series did is they helped they grounded what was comic book, what was animated before. They grounded it, gave it a bit more dramatic heft, had human beings who could like Hugh Jackman did it. Anna Paquin did excellent jobs with their characters in that movie, but they added to the scope of things. They kind of they made something that, even if it couldn't necessarily go as far as the anime did, or the animated series did or the comic books could do at that point in time. They at least gave you something that felt like it had the proper scale, that felt like an expansion of what you saw in the movies concerning superheroes. It's it's the later Superman movies versus the first Superman movies that had this greater sort of sense of uh, weight to them, a greater sort of drama to them. You know, people think that when you're dealing with genre subjects, when you're dealing with comic book movies, when you're dealing with your standard sort of science fiction or fantasy film, that you can get away with more things. So just you can be sloppy, you can be lazy with the storytelling. No, in fact, you got to be better. In fact, you've got to think things through more seriously, more with greater sort of attention to detail. You've got to learn how to construct things so that there is an authenticity to the feel of it. And too many folks approach it, as if they've got a license to make things stupid, silly in a stupid way. I mean, there's brainless fun sometimes to be had, but it's like I can't escape the impression that the people who looked at Cowboy Bebop thought, this is just a cartoon. This is just an anime. This is just, we're you know, we're not going to do all these, bright, colorful sort of things, or we're going to do something like, say, I mean, I when they first set out that teaser with the opening sequence, that struck me as somewhat not simply disappointing but worrisome. And the reason why is that it kind of seemed like they were going in a direction that was more like Sin City, that they were kind of going to lean into that aspect. And I guess looking at that, it was like, okay, um, what's the point? It's a cartoon, but the thing about anime that's made it successful, I think, is that their they take the things they do very seriously. They take the music seriously. They take the writings of the characters very seriously. They give backstories that are gradually revealed to different antagonists. They give goals and things for the main characters to pursue. They respect, I think, the material a lot more. Um, and you see something like Avatar: The Last Airbender, and they do a lot of the same sort of stuff. They do the same sort of development and world building and things. And you get this perhaps you get the same sort of the same sort of approach. I think that maybe caused the the movie version of that to tank like it did. It's sort of like I mean, one thing is trying to make a 20-hour, 10-hour uh, thing into one feature, or trying to compress things. Another element would be putting filler into things. There was this movie a while back called Imposter. Um, it was supposed to be originally part of this anthology. I forget what the name of the anthology was, but um, they made this sort of storyline where um, Gary Sinise is this weapons scientist who, pardon me here, is this weapons scientist who gets embroiled in this investigation with Vincent D'Onofrio's investigator. Um, and they padded the hell out of this thing, and they kind of just stuck in this whole sequence to fill in that time. And you can almost you could surgically cut at the points where he shows up at this hospital, and at this next point where I think he leaves that same hospital after returning to it. You could excise almost all of that plot out of it, and you'd get back to the original version, which I think was on the I think it was on the DVD of that particular movie. And it's like folks need to realize that there's a sort of a living nature to TV shows, to movies, that there is a sort of a connective tissue, a sort of a way in which things fit together, that if you understand it well enough, you can make a longer story seem shorter. And if you don't understand it well enough, you can make a shorter story feel longer. And that what they did is made, these shorter stories feel longer. They drained they drained the villain of his compelling qualities, drained the femme fatale of her, you know, of her mystery and her, you know, they made her feel less lost, if you will, less like a mystery, less like somebody who you just get hints and glimpses of, and then kind of you know ultimately you want people. I mean, folks in today's entertainment world love to do the things that get attention. They're masters of grabbing attention. But it's not just about grabbing attention. It's not just about getting attention. It's about rewarding attention and keeping attention over the long term, keeping people pulled into the story, not just simply, you know, having them, okay, we've got your ass in the seat, so we're just going to get. Um, so really, I feel like they included a lot of the elements of the originals and front loaded a lot of the character detail, and but they didn't do a lot of the real important work to make things to keep things interesting, to keep people engaged. They foregrounded the subplot with Vicious and with Julia, and by doing so, really just you know they formed an arc, I guess, a story arc at the expense of really of understanding the way the original story managed its, the outlay of details, the kaleidoscopic sort of variety that kind of made the story more interested. The all the great set pieces, they shrunk the scale of it. They ended up kind of putting less into these stories than ultimately people got out of the originals. And that, not any sort of wokeness or anything else, is why Netflix failed here. Because if their object was to please the fans of the original, it looks like they failed to understand what the appeal of the original was and failed to replicate that in what they did. They should have realized that, those two characters, those are mystery characters. Those are characters you just see on the side, and they gradually become more important. They should have treated, if Spike Spiegel was Iron Man, they should have treated Vicious as Thanos. A character to be gradually brought out of the shadows. And even once you've brought him out of the shadows, you need to keep him uh, an intimidating opponent, a presence, where if he walks into a scene, people are going to get hurt. You know the characters who fight him are going to have a difficult time dealing with him if they can survive the encounter at all. I mean, that's what they did well with Thanos. They made him a menacing character. They saved him until he was more relevant to the story. They built him up. They built up the legend of the character. You know, they didn't just they didn't just sort of make it, just dump him out. This is sort of, the you need to take time. You need to be patient with, long storylines when you long term storylines. And I don't think people are patient enough. They keep on thinking that it's something that was just done instant. But you don't get even mention of the Avengers until late in Iron Man 1. You don't really get any sense of you get glimpses of other characters, and they have their own little movies, and that sets them up to do great, even more substantial stuff later on as you grow towards the Avengers. And with Avengers, you finally see, finally get a good look at him, and when he says, to court them, to battle with them is to court death, and then you have him turning around and he's smiling. And then as things go on, as you build up the characters, as you build up the situations, then you have Thanos be the main antagonist, and then you have then you show him beating the crap out of the Incredible Hulk, who traditionally beats the crap out of everybody else. And then you go and you have him defeat everybody and do the snap, and then you have a character to be reckoned with, and you don't have him be this sort of sniveling character. You have him be this character who has an odd kind of integrity to him, who has an odd kind of who has strength to him. He's not simply an inferior reflection of the main characters. He is his own. He is. he is a villain to measure the heroes against. And I don't mind the way John Cho did Spike Spiegel. He did a fantastic job as far as I'm concerned. But if you don't have a character with enough strength, they end up having to shift, the balance over towards Julia in the end of this particular version. And the more you think about it, it's sort of because you know the vicious they create isn't that good of a villain. He's not scary enough. He is not anywhere near um, Spike Spiegel's equal. They just, I don't know. I don't know what pressures they were under that led them to make the choices they did. But a mistake is a mistake, and they made plenty here. And that's basically my opinion on it. So I'll talk to you guys later.